Welcome back to Nuclear Proliferation Explained. I'm William Spaniel. Today's topic is how domestic political considerations can cause countries to develop nuclear weapons. I'm going to identify 5 vectors by which this can happen, so let's just get to it. First up is standard diversionary theory. This borrows directly from diversionary theories of war. In that framework, a leader fights a war not because it's in the country's best security interest, but rather because the leader benefits by shifting political narratives toward that. Imagine there's some sort of domestic political turmoil. Maybe the leader is poor at running the economy. Well, the media and domestic political conversation are probably going to be focused on that. The leader doesn't like that. So the leader might want to start a war elsewhere. If the leader is better at running a war than running the economy, then the shift in the narrative is going to be relatively positive. The leader benefits from that. In effect, the leader is exploiting a principal-agent problem. The leader knows more about what is actually in the country's best security interest. And so the leader can spin a narrative that the war that's being fought under false pretense is actually good for the country. Well, you can do that same sort of story instead of war and have it be about nuclear weapons instead. India's nuclear arc fits partially within this diversionary framework. At the time of the Smiling Buddha test, Indira Gandhi's polling was at an all-time low. The country was undergoing a recession, riots were breaking out within parts of India, and a railway strike began on May 8, 1974. Just 10 days later, India conducts that Smiling Buddha test. Of course, the narrative behind it is that the Smiling Buddha test was a peaceful nuclear explosion. In practice, we know that really these things are about security. Yet oddly, the military was kept in the dark. You would think that if the Smiling Buddha test was actually about maximizing India's security, the military would have been kept apprised. They weren't. And that's suggestive that the test was really about scoring domestic political points. And sure enough, Indira Gandhi received a surge in the polls right afterward. Faith was partially restored in her government. And also intriguing here is that there was a very long gap after the 1974 test before India actually developed a nuclear weapon properly. Again, if the test was about security, you would think that there would be, in short order, development of a nuclear weapon afterward. There wasn't. The second domestic political consideration is pork. This is less about diversion and taking advantage of principal-agent problems, and more about using the position of power to control funds and buy off particularly important constituents. This is helpful in understanding Indonesia's exploration. President Sukarno had a general who was very interested in developing nuclear weapons. And so by signing off on that sort of project, President Sukarno could secure his support, which would in turn be helpful for maintaining his regime. Pork connects to the third topic, lobbying. Lobbying is the organized influence of legislators. You hire a lobbyist because you have a particular special interest. That lobbyist will then go to wherever legislatures convene and convince legislators to vote in favor of bills that you support. This can make it difficult to reverse nuclear programs. When you start a nuclear program, you are creating jobs in the nuclear industry, good paying ones too. That's a lot of money going around, and that money can empower lobbying. People with those jobs in the nuclear industry don't want to lose them, and so they can use part of the money that they're making to fund lobbyists to convince legislators not to change things, to keep everything as it is, maintain that status quo of a continued nuclear industry. And as a result of these well-funded lobbyists, it can be harder to stop a program after it's been started than it would be to stop a program before it is started. Before getting to the next topic, I want to take a step back. Let's zoom out and look at every country that has began pursuit of nuclear weapons since India's test. What do these countries have in common? Well, not a single one of them were full-fledged democracies at the time of nuclear pursuit initiation. That's curious. And there are a couple of reasons why we might see that in the data. The first is something known as the Guardianship Dilemma. Imagine you're Saddam Hussein and you really don't like Iran. Naturally, you might want to try coercing Iran. And to do that, you might build a few tanks. Well, a few tanks isn't going to get you very far, so maybe you'll build a lot more. And then you'll use those tanks to threaten Iran. Say, Iran, if you don't buckle to my demands, there are going to be military consequences. But if you're a dictator like Saddam Hussein, you face a problem. Those tanks that are useful for coercing Iran are also useful for coercing you. If you do something that upsets the military commanders, or the majority of the military force itself, instead of having those tanks go toward Iran, those tanks might point themselves back at your Capitol building. This is the Guardianship Dilemma. The more you build up your own military force, if you're not careful, the greater a threat the military is to your regime. Nuclear weapons are useful in this regard because they concentrate power. Rather than distributing power to a bunch of different tank drivers and tank commanders and tank units, you get a button. And that button can fire a nuclear weapon. You can use those nuclear weapons to threaten and coerce Iran. It's much more difficult for those nuclear weapons to somehow come back and hurt you. Even if a military commander were able to commandeer command and control of the nuclear weapon, it's going to be difficult to fire that nuclear weapon on yourself without damaging lots of the country in the process. As a result, if you're an autocrat, developing a nuclear weapon looks relatively more attractive as compared to the same sorts of incentives that a Democrat faces. The final topic is regime insurance. Think about the Libyan nuclear arc. In 2003, Gaddafi gave up his weapons program. Libya signed an agreement with the IAEA and shipped what little nuclear material they had to the United States. By some accounts, Gaddafi would go on to regret that decision. In 2011, a civil war broke out in Libya. The Libyan government had an advantage, though. The rebels were vulnerable to the Libyan Air Force. And if the status quo would maintain itself for a sustained period of time, the rebels stood very little chance of winning the war. NATO stepped in to resolve that Libyan rebel problem. They established a no-fly zone and basically dismantled the Libyan Air Force. This allowed the Libyan rebels to survive and indeed eventually defeat Gaddafi. Gaddafi would be killed by the end of the war. Imagine a hypothetical world where Libya has nuclear weapons in 2011. It seems unlikely that the US would have sponsored a no-fly zone. After all, the US received relatively little value in overthrowing Gaddafi. And if you compare that to how much damage a single nuclear weapon could do to Washington, D.C., or New York City, or even US interests in something more proximate like Italy, it's no contest. It would not have been worth it. But in some ways, this is an empty counterfactual. Libya's program was very poorly run, and it's difficult to believe that within 8 years, had Libya not given up its program, that Libya would have had a nuclear weapon to deter the US. Moreover, it's reasonable to think that the start of the civil war was delayed by the agreement. After all, Libya received sanctions relief, and that sanctions relief, in theory, should have made it easier for Gaddafi to keep opponents at bay for longer. Nevertheless, you can see why this sort of behavior is worrisome to dictators around the world. The US has a habit of doing this. Think about Panama and Noriega, and Iraq and Saddam. Libya is not an isolated case. And this is why convincing North Korea to give up its nuclear weapons is a bit of a non-starter. A nuclear deterrent is regime insurance for Kim Jong-un. Giving up those nuclear weapons might make it much more likely for the United States or South Korea or some other regional power to try to overthrow his government. Moreover, it might reduce the probability that he faces any sort of uprising to begin with. Think about what happened in Libya. The Libyan rebels could only survive that war if they received help from an international partner. If they knew that no international partner would be forthcoming, they might not have begun that war to begin with. All told, that makes nuclear weapons valuable for North Korea and why it's going to be difficult for North Korea to give them up. That's it for this lecture on domestic politics. I hope you enjoyed it, and I hope to see you next time. Take care.